In this video, we're going to talk about a general overview of plants, talk a little bit about the evolution of plants from aquatic to terrestrial environments, describe a little bit of the structure and function of plants, and then do a little bit more with some plant physiology. So to start off, the movement from aquatic plants to terrestrial environments required a couple of different adaptations, and this is just a list of some of those adaptations that allow those land plants to be successful. Land plants developed a cell wall and a cuticle. Both of these allow the plant or provide the plant with extra support, and then the cuticle will actually protect the plant from extra desiccation, which is transpiration or water loss. The development of roots and hairs, which help with water absorption, because in land you're not surrounded by water anymore, and so we have to increase surface area and increase mechanisms in which to obtain water. Xylem and phloem, which are found in vascular plants, allow for the transport of water and glucose. Stomates evolved, which allowed for gas exchange to occur, and so giving off oxygen and bringing in carbon dioxide to drive photosynthesis. Seeds and pollen for reproduction, and then there have also been an evolution of a symbiotic relationship between land plants and mycorrhizae, and these are this is a fungus that helps aid in water absorption, and so that's a symbiotic relationship there. Here's just a phylogenetic tree to show the vast difference in land plants. So you have a common ancestor, which we believe was aquatic, and then over time it diverged into several different types of plants. So all the way from liverworts, hornworts, mosses, club mosses, horsetails, whisk ferns, and then the last two, which are the two that we most are concerned with, gymnosperms and angiosperms. Angiosperms being flowering plants, and then gymnosperms being those not having flowers. So that's the main group, or the main clade that we focus on, are the seed plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So moving into a little bit about the structure of plants, it's pretty important that you understand how the leaf is set up. We've talked about this with photosynthesis, and this is a cross-section of what a leaf looks like. You should be able to go through and label most of these parts of a leaf. Exposed to the outside, you're going to have what's called a stomata, which allows for gas exchange. So that stomata is the opening, and it's surrounded by some guard cells. We're going to talk about that in just a second, how those two work together. So at the very top, you have the waxy cuticle. Right below that cuticle, which prevents desiccation, you have what we call the upper epidermis, very similar to the epidermis that you talk about on human skin. Right below that, you have these very linear mesophyll cells, and they're called palisade mesophyll cells. And they are photosynthetic. So this is where all the photosynthesis takes place. Below the palisade mesophyll, you have this very spongy layer, and it's very loose and has a lot of air space in it. And that classifies the spongy mesophyll. Right below, or mixed into that spongy mesophyll, you will find vascular bundles or veins, which allow for transport throughout that leaf. Right below that, you have your lower epidermis, and then you also have the waxy cuticle. So the top and the bottom are pretty much parallel to each other. And then you also have, again, on the other side, stomata and guard cells, which allow for gas exchange to occur. So I want to talk a little bit more about stomata and guard cells, because it's a very unique function of plants, and it was very advantageous moving from land to water, or from water to land, excuse me. And so these guard cells surround this small opening for gas exchange to occur, and the guard cells are themselves photosynthetic. So what happens is that in times of darkness, drought, cold, maybe there's a pathogen going around, or there's a plant hormone, ABA, which is a pretty common hormone, all of these factors contribute the guard cells to close. And so what happens is these guard cells shrink, or they shrivel, and that shriveling allows them to close together, preventing that stomata from opening. Now in optimal conditions like light, a lot of carbon dioxide, or another plant hormone called auxin, those guard cells will actually start swelling due to water movement. And so when they swell, they push out against each other, and the stomata is open. We've talked about this when we talked about different pathways of photosynthesis. So when plants open their stomata at different times of day, for example, that is controlled by these guard cells and subsequently these plant hormones. Quick review of water potential. Remember, water is going to move from an area of a high water potential to an area of low water potential. And just to kind of summarize this diagram here of how it looks, you typically go from the soil to the root, stem, leaf, and air. And this is going from an area of a high water potential to an area of a low water potential, or high concentration to low concentration. And remember, osmosis kind of facilitates this movement of water across cell membranes. It's also important to talk about this concept of bulk flow, which is the movement of liquid in response to a pressure gradient. And unlike osmosis, which remember is dependent on solute concentration, so how much solute is in that water, bulk flow is independent of that. It means it doesn't really depend on the amount of solute in a liquid. And so we're going to talk about these vascular tissues, phloem and xylem. Phloem is the movement of sugar molecules that are made in the leaves in those mesophyll cells to the rest of the plant. You can kind of see that over here, the red. So it's made up here near that upper epidermis, and it needs to go everywhere else from the leaf and the rest of the plant, so the stem and everything. And then xylem actually takes that water from the roots, hair, and the mycorrhizae, and it moves that water up a gradient, and that's seen in that blue line. And then going back to a concept we introduced at the beginning of the year, that's something called a transpirational pool cohesion tension theory. It's a mouthful, but break it down. Transpiration is the loss of water from a leaf, and then cohesion is the ability of water molecules to stick together. So what this theory says is that for each molecule of water that evaporates from a leaf by transpiration, another molecule of water is drawn in at the root to replace it. And so this theory is how plants will typically continue to bring that water up into a plant, or how xylem works. Very quickly moving on, we're going to talk briefly about hormones and tropisms. We've already talked about auxins and ABA as two hormones that allow that stomata to open and close. Tropisms, remember, tropism is a response to a stimulus, and so you can have a positive tropism, which is movement towards a stimulus, or a negative tropism, which is the movement away from a stimulus. And so the three main types of tropisms plants exhibit are thigmotropism, so to touch, movement to touch, geotropism, which is to gravity. This is due to predominantly auxins and statoliths, which are plant hormones, and then phototropisms, which are the response of light. And this is caused mostly by auxins, which are produced on the dark side of the plant. They grow, which is what causes the plant to bend, or the stem to bend, because it's heavy on one side. Plants can also exhibit a circadian rhythm. You should have already watched that video. And they are responsive to the amount of daylight, and this is called photoperiod. And so they exhibit something called photoperiodism, or periodism, which is when plants respond to various amounts of light. Particularly, we're going to talk very briefly about phytochromes and how phytochromes aid in this response to light. And so what happens is that in response to daylight, phytochrome or PR form is transformed into PFR. And so when light is absent, PFR is converted to PR form. And so this different conversions of form from PR to PFR and backwards is actually how the plant can sense or use that circadian rhythm to the amount of light that there is. So the plant can actually sense when it's daytime and when it's nighttime through this hormone. And that is very important for plants that are going to flower or reproduce at certain times of the day. And then just to wrap up, plants have this really cool adaptation where they've developed something called an alternation of generations. This alternation of generations means that they have two phases, a sporophyte and a gametophyte. Take, for example, humans, which have predominantly a diploid stage or a multicellular diploid stage. Plants have both. So the sporophyte is going to be the phase of the plant where it produces spores, which do not have to fuse with another organism. They can just rather reproduce through mitosis. So they'll develop into a new organism through mitosis. And then the gametophyte, which actually produces gametes. And so there's these two phases throughout a plant's life, which is pretty unique to land plants.